close your eyes and let me tell you a story that will carry you gently into sleep. A story of love so powerful it shook the ancient world, so passionate it defied empires, and so tragic it became legend. Tonight, we journey back over 2,000 years to the shores of the Mediterranean, where the fate of Rome hung in the balance and two souls found each other across the chaos of war and politics. This is not just any love story. This is the tale of Cleopatra, the last pharaoh of Egypt, and Marcus Antonius, the Roman general who would risk everything for her touch. Their romance would reshape the ancient world, topple kingdoms, and echo through history as one of the greatest love affairs ever lived. But before we meet our lovers, let me paint you the world they inhabited. Picture the Mediterranean in 44 BC, a sea surrounded by empires hungry for power. Rome, the great republic, had grown fat on conquest, but was tearing itself apart from within. Egypt, ancient and wealthy, still remembered when pharaohs were gods and the Nile was the center of all civilization. Between these two worlds, political alliances shifted like desert sands, and ambitious men plotted in marble halls while ships carried gold and grain across blue waters. The air smelled of salt and spices, of incense burning in temples, and wine flowing in banquet halls. Slaves rode galleys under burning suns, while their masters debated the fate of nations. This was a world where a single decision could topple dynasties, where love and war danced together, and where two hearts would soon beat as one against the rhythm of history itself. Now, let your breathing slow as we travel back to Alexandria, that jewel of the ancient world. Imagine walking through streets where Greek philosophers debated under Egyptian stars, where the great lighthouse guided ships from every corner of the known world. The library held all human knowledge, and the palace gleamed with marble and gold. Here lived a woman who spoke 9 languages, who could charm senators and command fleets, who was both pharaoh and goddess to her people. Cleopatra was not the beauty that Hollywood would later imagine. Ancient sources tell us her power lay not in her appearance, but in her voice, her intelligence, her presence. When she spoke, men listened. When she laughed, rooms fell silent. When she walked into a hall, the very air seemed to shimmer with possibility. She had already seduced Julius Caesar himself, the most powerful man in Rome, and borne him a son. But Caesar was dead now, stabbed by senators who feared his growing power, and Cleopatra found herself alone again, ruling a kingdom that needed Roman protection to survive. Meanwhile, across the sea in Rome, another man was rising to power. Marcus Antonius, called Mark Antony by history, was everything Caesar had not been. Where Caesar was calculated, Antony was passionate. Where Caesar was lean and sharp, Antony was broad and strong. He loved wine, loved laughter, loved the roar of crowds and the clash of swords. He was a soldier's soldier, a man who could drink all night and fight all day, who won loyalty through courage and lost it through excess. After Caesar's assassination, Rome had split 3 ways. Octavian, Caesar's adopted heir, controlled the west. Lepidus held Africa, and Antony ruled the east, including all those wealthy provinces that bordered Egypt. He was tasked with bringing order to lands that had known only chaos, with collecting tribute from kings and queens who had grown too comfortable in their independence. It was inevitable that he would summon Cleopatra to account for Egypt's loyalty. What neither of them expected was what would happen when they finally met. The meeting was set for Tarsus, a city in modern-day Turkey where the river met the sea. Cleopatra could have arrived as a supplicant, dressed in simple robes with a small retinue, ready to grovel before Roman power. Instead, she chose to make an entrance that would be remembered for centuries. Picture this scene as your mind drifts toward sleep. The afternoon sun glints off the water as a magnificent barge appears on the horizon. Its sails are purple silk, its oars are silver, and its prow is carved with golden dolphins that seem to dance through the waves. The air fills with the sound of flutes and lyres, with singing voices that carry across the water like birdsong. But it is the woman on the deck who takes every breath away. Cleopatra reclines beneath a canopy of gold cloth, dressed as Aphrodite, the goddess of love. Her attendants are costumed as sea nymphs, their hair flowing like water, their movements graceful as swans. Incense burns in golden braziers, filling the air with the scent of myrrh and frankincense. The entire barge seems to float not on water, but on dreams themselves. Word spreads through Tarsus like wildfire. The marketplace empties, the taverns drain, and even Roman soldiers abandon their posts to catch a glimpse of this floating vision. By the time the barge reaches the dock, half the city has gathered to watch. Among them stands Mark Antony himself, trying to maintain his dignity while his heart pounds like a war drum. He had summoned a queen to answer for her kingdom's debts. Instead, a goddess had arrived to claim his soul. That evening, Cleopatra invited Antony to dine aboard her barge. Again, she transformed the ordinary into the magical. The deck was covered with roses, ankle-deep, their perfume heavy in the warm night air. Torches flickered like captured stars, and musicians played melodies that seemed to come from the gods themselves. The feast was beyond imagination. Course after course of delicacies from every corner of the world, wines that had aged in Pharaoh's cellars, fruits that tasted like concentrated sunshine. But Antony barely noticed the food. He could not take his eyes off his hostess. Cleopatra spoke to him not as queen to general, not as subject to master, but as woman to man. She told him stories of her kingdom, of the ancient wisdom of Egypt, of the mysteries that lay buried beneath the desert sands. Her voice was like honey mixed with wine, sweet but intoxicating. When she laughed, it was music. When she moved, it was poetry. For his part, Antony found himself speaking of things he had never shared with anyone. His dreams of glory, his fears of failure, the loneliness that came with command. She listened without judgment, her dark eyes reflecting the torchlight, her presence making him feel like the hero he had always wanted to be. As the night wore on and the wine flowed freely, something shifted between them. The political became personal, the strategic became intimate. Two of the most powerful people in the world discovered they were simply a man and woman, drawn to each other, across the space between their couches, across the gulf between their nations, across all the reasons why they should remain enemies. When Antony finally returned to shore in the early hours of dawn, he was already lost. The Roman general who had come to collect tribute from a vassal queen was leaving as a man in love with a goddess who happened to rule Egypt. The next day, he could think of nothing but her. Her laugh echoed in his ears. Her perfume seemed to linger on his clothes. He found excuses to return to her barge, telling himself it was diplomacy while knowing it was desire. Each evening brought new wonders, new conversations that lasted until the stars began to fade. New moments when their eyes would meet and the rest of the world would disappear. Cleopatra, for her part, was equally enchanted. She had known Caesar's cold brilliance, had been awed by his intellect and power, but Antony was fire where Caesar had been ice. He was passion made flesh, a man who lived each moment as if it might be his last. When he spoke of his battles, his eyes blazed with remembered glory. When he held her hand, his touch burned like a brand. She had summoned him as an ally, but she was falling in love with him as a woman. The people of Tarsus watched this courtship with wonder and growing concern. Roman discipline began to crumble as soldiers spent their time gossiping about their general's romance instead of drilling. Egyptian servants whispered of their queen's radiant happiness. Merchants made fortunes, selling roses and wine to feed the endless celebrations aboard the royal barge. But beyond Tarsus, darker forces were already stirring. In Rome, Octavian received reports of his fellow triumvir's behavior with cold calculation. Antony was supposed to be securing the eastern provinces, not dallying with foreign queens. Every day he spent in Cleopatra's arms was a day Rome's enemies grew stronger, a day Octavian himself grew more powerful by comparison. In Alexandria, Cleopatra's advisors warned her that she was playing a dangerous game. Egypt needed Roman protection, but not at the cost of becoming a Roman province. If Antony fell from power, what would become of their kingdom? What would become of their queen? Yet, neither Antony nor Cleopatra could bring themselves to care about these warnings. They were drunk on each other, intoxicated by a love that felt larger than politics, stronger than empires, more important than the fate of nations. When they looked into each other's eyes, they saw not Roman and Egyptian, not conqueror and conquered, but simply two souls who had found their other half. As autumn approached and the sailing season began to end, they faced their first separation. Antony's duties called him back to Rome, to his wife Fulvia and his political obligations. Cleopatra had to return to Alexandria, to her throne and her responsibilities as pharaoh. The lovers who had spent months living in a dream of eternal summer suddenly faced the cold reality of distance and duty. Their last night together was bittersweet, filled with promises and tears, with passionate embraces and whispered vows. As dawn broke over the harbor at Tarsus, they stood together on the deck of Cleopatra's barge, watching the sun paint the sky in shades of gold and rose. Neither wanted to say goodbye. Both knew they must. But as their ships sailed in opposite directions, carrying them toward their separate destinies, neither could know that this was only the beginning of their story. Love had taken root in their hearts, and like the lotus flowers of the Nile, it would bloom again when the seasons turned. Their romance would reshape the ancient world, topple kingdoms, and burn itself into history as one of the greatest love affairs ever lived. For now, though, let their first goodbye carry you gently toward your own dreams, knowing that true love, once kindled, can never truly die. Never truly die. The months that followed their separation felt like years to both lovers. Antony returned to Rome, carrying Cleopatra's memory like a flame in his chest, while she ruled Egypt with thoughts of him never far from her mind. But the world would not let them rest in their longing. Politics moved like storm clouds, gathering on the horizon, and both would soon discover that love between rulers is never a private affair. In Rome, Antony found a city changed by his absence. His wife, Fulvia, had died while he was away. Her final words, reportedly a curse, upon the Egyptian queen who had stolen her husband's heart. The streets buzzed with whispers about his Eastern romance, and senators who had once courted his favor now watched him with calculating eyes. Octavian, young and ambitious, had spent the months strengthening his position, gathering allies who whispered that perhaps Antony was no longer fit to rule a third of the Roman world. To secure his political survival, Antony made a choice that would haunt him for years to come. He agreed to marry Octavian's sister, Octavia, a woman of virtue and intelligence who deserved better than a husband whose heart belonged to another. The marriage was celebrated throughout Rome as a symbol of unity between the two most powerful men in the Republic. Yet on his wedding night, as Antony lay beside his new bride, his thoughts drifted across the Mediterranean to a palace in Alexandria, where a queen waited for word that never came. Meanwhile, Cleopatra ruled Egypt with iron discipline masking a broken heart. She threw herself into the business of kingship, meeting with advisors until the late hours, inspecting granaries and temples, commissioning new buildings that would stand as monuments to her reign. But her servants noticed how she would pause, sometimes in the middle of conversations, her eyes distant, as if listening for footsteps that would never come. When word reached Alexandria of Antony's marriage, she received the news in public with the stoic grace expected of a pharaoh. In private, she wept tears that seemed to carry the salt of every sea between them. Yet even as political necessity forced them apart, fate was already weaving the threads that would bring them together again. The Parthians, Rome's ancient enemies, had invaded Syria and were threatening the eastern provinces that Antony was sworn to protect. No Roman general could ignore such a challenge and hope to maintain his reputation. Duty called him back to the lands where he had first tasted love, back to the waters where Cleopatra's barge had once carried him into dreams. As Antony prepared for war, he found himself facing an uncomfortable truth. Egypt's wealth and naval power were crucial to any eastern campaign. The grain ships of Alexandria could feed his legions. The gold of the pharaohs could pay his soldiers, and the swift galleys of the Egyptian fleet could control the sea lanes. He told himself that summoning Cleopatra was military necessity, not personal desire, but his heart beat faster when he dictated the message requesting her presence, and his hands trembled slightly as he sealed it with his ring. Cleopatra read his summons in the cool shadows of her palace library, surrounded by scrolls containing all the wisdom of the ancient world. Her advisors urged caution, reminding her of the political dangers of being seen as too close to Rome. But as she held the papyrus bearing Antony's seal, she felt the old fire stirring in her veins. The pharaoh might counsel patience, but the woman remembered stolen kisses under starlight and conversations that lasted until dawn. She ordered her ships prepared for departure. Their reunion took place not in the romantic setting of Tarsus, but in the harsh military camp of Antioch, where Antony was marshaling his forces for the Parthian campaign. Gone were the golden barges and rose-strewn banquets. Instead, they met in a commander's tent, surrounded by the sounds of soldiers drilling and horses stamping in their lines. Yet, when their eyes met across the space between duty and desire, all the months of separation seemed to vanish like morning mist. This time, their love carried a different weight. They were no longer young lovers, drunk on first passion, but two people who had learned the cost of separation, who understood that the world would always try to tear them apart. Their embraces held desperation as well as joy. Their kisses tasted of tears as well as wine. They had perhaps weeks together before the campaign began, and both knew that war was a jealous mistress who might claim one or both of them before they could meet again. In those precious days at Antioch, they tried to recapture the magic of their first meeting while planning for an uncertain future. Cleopatra brought not just herself, but Egypt's resources to support Antony's war effort. Her ships joined his fleet, her gold filled his war chest, and her presence gave him something more valuable than any treasure. She gave him hope, the belief that a man could be both conqueror and lover, that victory in war might lead to happiness and peace. But their private moments were stolen between meetings with generals and inspections of supply trains. They would walk together in the evening air, talking of everything except the dangers that lay ahead. Cleopatra spoke of the book she was reading, the building she planned for Alexandria, the son she had left behind in Egypt. Antony described his soldiers, his strategies, his dreams of triumph that would finally give them the security to love without fear. Sometimes they would simply sit in silence, watching the sun set over the Syrian hills, memorizing each other's faces against the possibility that these might be their last days together. In those quiet moments, the queen and the general disappeared, leaving only a man and woman who had found in each other something worth risking everything to keep. The night before, Antony marched east toward Parthia. They made promises that seemed more like prayers. He swore to return victorious, to make her his empress when Rome was secure under his rule. She promised to wait for him, to keep Egypt strong and prosperous, until he came back to claim both her and her kingdom. They sealed their vows, not with rings or ceremonies, but with kisses that tasted of forever and touches that burned themselves into memory. As dawn broke and the legions formed their marching columns, Cleopatra stood watching from the walls of Antioch as the man she loved rode away to war. The sight of his red cloak disappearing into the dust clouds, raised by 20,000 marching feet, was almost more than she could bear. Yet, she remained there until the last supply wagon had vanished over the hills, her hand pressed to her heart as if she could hold his love there by will alone. What neither of them knew as they parted was that Antony's Parthian campaign would prove to be a disaster that would shake his reputation and weaken his position in the deadly game of Roman politics. The eastern kingdoms he hoped to conquer would instead humble his legions, and the gold he needed to secure his future would slip through his fingers like desert sand. When he finally limped back from the campaign, months later, he would be a changed man, marked by failure and desperate for the comfort that only Cleopatra could provide. Tiens, but that is a story for tomorrow's dreams. For now, let the image of their last night together carry you into sleep. Two lovers holding each other against the darkness, whispering promises they would move heaven and earth to keep. In the candlelit tent, with the sounds of an army settling into rest around them, they found a peace that would have to sustain them through all the trials ahead. True love, they learned, is not just joy and passion, but the courage to face an uncertain world together, whatever the cost. Uncertain world together, whatever the cost. The disaster in Parthia changed everything. When Antony finally returned from the Eastern campaign, he was no longer the confident general who had marched away with dreams of conquest. His legions had been decimated in the mountain passes, his reputation tarnished by defeat, and his treasury emptied by the cost of retreat. The man who limped back to Syria was hollow-eyed and haunted, carrying the weight of 20,000 Roman graves on his shoulders. Yet it was in this darkest hour that love proved its true strength. When word reached Alexandria of Antony's defeat, Cleopatra did not hesitate. She gathered a fleet laden with supplies, gold, and fresh troops, sailing north, not to a triumphant general, but to a broken man who needed her more than ever. Their reunion on the beaches of Syria was tender and desperate, two souls clinging to each other in a world that seemed determined to destroy them. In Cleopatra's arms, Antony found healing that no physician could provide. She did not reproach him for his failure or question his judgment. Instead, she reminded him of victories yet to be won, of the love they shared that made them stronger together than either could be alone. Her faith in him became his faith in himself, her strength, his foundation for rebuilding what had been lost. Together, they retreated to Alexandria, that glittering jewel by the sea, where they could forget, for a time, the harsh realities of Roman politics. In the palace gardens overlooking the harbor, they created their own world, where passion reigned supreme and duty could wait until tomorrow. Cleopatra showed Antony the Egypt beyond the throne room, taking him on expeditions up the Nile to see the ancient temples where pharaohs had been crowned for 3,000 years. They sailed past villages where farmers worked fields that had been green since before Rome was founded, past monuments that made the newest Roman buildings seem like children's toys. At night, they would anchor near temple complexes and listen to priests chanting prayers in languages older than memory, under stars that had watched over Egypt since the pyramids were built. They made love with the intensity of people who knew their time was borrowed from fate. In Alexandria, they established a court that became legendary for its magnificence. The donations of Alexandria, they called their grand ceremony, where Antony distributed kingdoms to Cleopatra and their children, like a god dispensing favors to mortals. She appeared dressed as Isis, the mother goddess of Egypt, while he wore the robes of Dionysus, god of wine and ecstasy. To their supporters, it was a celebration of love triumphant. To their enemies, it was proof that Antony had abandoned Roman values for Eastern decadence. Their daily life together took on a rhythm that felt almost domestic despite its imperial scale. They would wake in chambers overlooking the great harbor, where merchant ships from across the Mediterranean brought tribute to their love. Breakfast became strategy sessions, disguised as intimate meals, where they planned not just military campaigns, but the architecture of dreams. Cleopatra would read him poetry while he dictated letters to his remaining allies, their voices weaving together in harmonies of power and passion. The afternoons belonged to governance and spectacle. Cleopatra held court with the wisdom of generations, while Antony trained with his soldiers, preparing for the battles he knew must come. Yet always they found moments to steal away together, to walk hand in hand through the museum where scholars debated philosophy, or to climb to the lighthouse's peak and survey the kingdom they ruled together. But even in paradise, shadows gathered. In Rome, Octavian was methodically destroying Antony's reputation, painting him as a man corrupted by foreign influence, a Roman who had forgotten his duty to serve barbarian queens. Letters arrived daily, reporting defections among Antony's supporters, describing how his former allies now questioned his loyalty to Rome itself. Each message was a dagger thrust into their happiness, a reminder that love alone could not hold back the tide of political necessity. Cleopatra watched her beloved struggle with these pressures and made a decision that would define both their fates. If the world would not let them love in peace, then they would love in war. Egypt's wealth and power would stand behind Antony's claim to Roman leadership. Their personal union would become a political alliance that could reshape the Mediterranean world. Together, they would either triumph as the rulers of a new empire or fall as martyrs to a love that defied every convention of their age. The preparation for war became a strange courtship ritual. They planned naval strategies over candlelit dinners, discussed troop movements while walking in moonlit gardens, and sealed military alliances with kisses that tasted of destiny. Their love had begun with a golden barge on a peaceful river. Now it would be tested in the crucible of battle, where victory meant ruling the world together, and defeat meant losing everything they held dear. As their combined fleets gathered in the harbors of Greece, both lovers knew they were gambling with stakes beyond imagination. Antony was risking the last remnants of his political career, his reputation, perhaps his life. Cleopatra was wagering her kingdom, her dynasty, the independence of Egypt itself. Yet, when they stood together on the deck of their flagship, watching hundreds of vessels prepare for the campaign that would decide their fate, neither felt fear. They felt only the intoxicating certainty that some loves are worth any price. The night before their fleet sailed for the final confrontation with Octavian, they held each other close in their cabin while the Mediterranean whispered against the hull. Tomorrow would bring the battle that would determine whether their love story ended in triumph or tragedy. But tonight, they were simply Mark Antony and Cleopatra, two people who had found in each other something more precious than all the gold in Egypt or all the glory of Rome. Their whispered conversations drifted from strategy to memory, from fears of tomorrow to gratitude for yesterday. They spoke of their children, of the legacy they hoped to leave, of the world they dreamed of building where love could exist without apology. As the hours passed and dawn approached, their words grew fewer, but their embraces grew fiercer, as if they could hold back time itself through the strength of their devotion. When the sun finally rose over the waters near Actium, it illuminated not just two fleets preparing for battle, but two hearts that had chosen to face destiny together. Whatever the gods had planned for them, they would meet it as they had met everything else since that first magical evening in Tarsus, united in a love that had already changed the world and was about to change it again. The battle that awaited them would be remembered by history as one of the most decisive naval engagements ever fought. But for Antony and Cleopatra, it was simply the price they were willing to pay for the right to love each other without shame, to rule together without apology, to write their names across the stars in letters of fire and blood, blood. The morning of September 2nd, 31 BC, dawned gray and ominous over the waters near Actium. Fog clung to the sea like the breath of sleeping gods, and the wind carried omens that neither side could ignore. On one horizon sat Octavian's fleet, disciplined Roman galleys arranged in perfect formation, their bronze rams gleaming like the teeth of some great sea monster. On the other waited the combined forces of Antony and Cleopatra, a magnificent armada that represented not just military might, but the dreams of two hearts beating as one. Cleopatra stood on the deck of her flagship, the wind catching her purple robes, as she surveyed the scene that would determine everything. Her vessel was a floating palace, its golden stern carved with images of Egyptian gods, its sails dyed the color of royalty. Around her, 60 of Egypt's finest warships waited in formation, their crews handpicked from the bravest sailors who had ever navigated the Nile. She had not come to this battle as a mere observer. She had come as pharaoh, as queen, as a woman fighting for the right to choose her own destiny. Beside her fleet, Antony commanded nearly 300 vessels of his own. the last loyal remnants of his once mighty following. But as the morning mist began to clear, both lovers could see the terrible arithmetic of their situation. Octavian's fleet outnumbered them. His ships were faster and more maneuverable. And worse still, defections had been bleeding Antony's forces for weeks. Captains who had once sworn undying loyalty now sailed under Octavian's banner, their betrayal cutting deeper than any sword thrust. Yet neither Antony nor Cleopatra spoke of retreat. They had cast their dice when they chose love over politics, passion over prudence. Now they would live or die by that choice, and both found a strange peace in the certainty of it. As the fog lifted and the sun painted the water gold, they shared what might be their final kiss, tasting salt spray and destiny on each other's lips. The battle began with the methodical precision that marked all Roman warfare. Octavian's admiral Agrippa had positioned his ships to block any escape route, while forcing the lovers into a fight that favored smaller, more agile vessels over the massive warships that Antony and Cleopatra commanded. The first ram strikes echoed across the water like thunder, bronze meeting bronze in explosions of splintered wood and screaming metal. From her command position, Cleopatra watched the battle unfold with the calculating eye of a ruler who had been trained in warfare since childhood. She could see how the engagement was developing, how Octavian's ships were slowly encircling their formation like wolves closing on wounded prey. Her Egyptian captains fought with the skill of men protecting their homeland. But skill alone would not be enough against the numerical advantage they faced. Antony, commanding from his own flagship nearby, threw himself into the battle with the fury of a man who had nothing left to lose. His voice carried across the water as he shouted orders and encouragement, his sword flashing in the morning light whenever enemy vessels came close enough for boarding actions. This was the Antony his soldiers remembered from a dozen victorious campaigns, the general who had never asked his men to face dangers he would not share. But as the hours passed, the tide of battle turned inexorably against them. Ship after ship, flying Antony's colors, struck their standards and surrendered to Octavian's forces. Others simply fled, their captains deciding that survival was worth more than loyalty to a doomed cause. The carefully planned formation began to dissolve into chaos as gaps appeared in their lines and enemy vessels poured through like water through a broken dam. It was then that Cleopatra made the decision that would define how history remembered this day. Seeing that the battle was lost, that continued fighting would only result in the needless deaths of brave men, she ordered her Egyptian squadron to break through the enemy lines and escape to open water. Some called it cowardice, others tactical wisdom, but those who knew her best understood it for what it truly was, the choice of a queen who refused to let Egypt die for the sake of Roman pride. Her golden ship, its oars flashing like wings in the sunlight, carved through the battle line with breathtaking audacity. Enemy vessels tried to intercept her, but the pharaoh's galley had been built for speed as well as ceremony. Behind her followed the surviving ships of Egypt's fleet, their crews pulling at the oars with desperate strength as they raced for the safety of open water. When Antony saw Cleopatra's ship breaking free from the battle, he faced the hardest choice of his life. His Roman training, his military honor, everything he had been taught about duty and sacrifice demanded that he stay and fight to the last man. But his heart, that part of him that had been reborn in her arms, could not bear the thought of a world without her in it. In a moment that shocked even his closest followers, the great Roman general abandoned his flagship and transferred to a smaller, faster vessel. With only a handful of loyal captains following him, he pursued Cleopatra's fleeing squadron, leaving behind the battle his remaining forces and his reputation as a Roman commander. Love had triumphed over duty, passion over politics, in the most public way imaginable. The pursuit lasted for hours, Octavian's victorious fleet chasing the lovers across the blue waters of the Ionian Sea. But Cleopatra's ships had too much of a head start, and as evening approached, their pursuers finally gave up the chase. As darkness fell over the Mediterranean, two lone figures stood together on the deck of the Pharaoh's flagship, holding each other against the night wind while their world burned behind them. They had escaped with their lives and with each other, but at a cost that would echo through the ages. Antony's remaining forces had been captured or killed. His political career was over, and Egypt now stood alone against the might of Rome. The lovers, who had dreamed of ruling the Mediterranean together, were now fugitives, dependent on the loyalty of a few remaining followers, and the hope that somehow, somewhere, they could rebuild what had been lost. The voyage back to Alexandria was a journey through grief and reckoning. Day after day, as their ships limped southward toward Egypt, Antony struggled with the magnitude of what he had done. He had abandoned his men, betrayed his Roman heritage, chosen personal happiness over public duty. The weight of it crushed him like a physical burden, and there were moments when Cleopatra feared she might lose him, not to enemy action, but to the darkness in his own soul. Yet slowly, as the familiar coastline of Egypt appeared on the horizon, both lovers began to find their footing again. They had lost a battle, but they had not lost each other. Their love had survived the ultimate test, proving stronger than honor, duty, or the expectations of the world. If they were to be remembered as failures, at least they would be remembered as failures who had dared to put love above everything else. As their battered fleet sailed into Alexandria's harbor, crowds gathered on the waterfront to welcome their queen home. These were her people, who had watched her grow from princess to pharaoh, who had celebrated her triumphs and would stand by her in defeat. For them, she was not just a ruler, but the living embodiment of Egypt itself, the last link to a glorious past, and their only hope for any kind of future. That night, in the palace where their love had flourished, Antony and Cleopatra held each other close and spoke quietly of what remained. They had perhaps months before Octavian's legions arrived to claim Egypt as the final prize in his victory. They could face that end with dignity, together, as they had faced everything else since that magical evening when a goddess had sailed to meet a general and found a man instead. Their great gamble had failed, but their love had endured. In the candlelit chambers overlooking the harbor, where merchant ships still brought goods from across the known world, two hearts beat in rhythm against the approaching darkness, knowing that some victories can only be measured in the currency of devotion. Some triumphs exist only in the space between two souls who refuse to let go. Refuse to let go. The months following Actium passed like a fever dream, each day blending into the next, as Alexandria held its breath, waiting for the inevitable. Yet in those stolen weeks, Antony and Cleopatra discovered something remarkable. Stripped of their grand ambitions, freed from the weight of empire building, they found a different kind of love. Not the passionate fire that had consumed them in their youth, but something deeper, quieter, more precious for being born from shared loss. They walked together through the palace gardens, where jasmine bloomed despite the approaching winter. Their conversations no longer focused on strategy and conquest, but on smaller, more intimate things. Cleopatra spoke of her childhood, of learning to read hieroglyphs by candlelight, while her tutors dozed. Antony told her about his first battle, how his hands had shaken so badly he could barely hold his sword, and how the veteran beside him had whispered jokes to calm his nerves. These conversations became their refuge from the steady stream of grim news that arrived daily. Cities throughout the East were declaring for Octavian. Former allies sent apologetic letters explaining why they could no longer support a lost cause. Ships that had once carried tribute to Alexandria now sailed past the harbor without stopping, their captains unwilling to risk association with a doomed regime. Yet the people of Alexandria remained loyal. Merchants still opened their shops each morning. Children still played in the streets. And fishermen still brought their catch to market as if the world were not ending around them. Their quiet dignity gave Cleopatra strength, reminding her that being pharaoh meant more than winning battles or commanding fleets. It meant being the living heart of a civilization that had endured for millennia and would somehow endure whatever came next. In the evenings, when the official business of the day was done, the lovers would climb to the palace's highest tower and watch the sun set over the Mediterranean. From that height, Alexandria spread below them like a jeweled map. The great lighthouse already beginning to glow with the fires that would guide ships safely to harbor through the night. In those quiet moments, with the sea breeze carrying the scent of salt and spices, they could almost pretend that tomorrow would bring nothing more challenging than deciding which wine to serve at dinner. But reality always intruded. Messengers arrived with increasing frequency, their news growing darker with each report. Octavian's legions were marching through Syria, accepting the surrender of cities that had once sworn loyalty to Antony. The young victor was methodically dismantling everything his rival had built, erasing 20 years of political achievement with the efficiency of a scribe correcting a manuscript. Cleopatra faced these reports with the stoic grace that had been bred into her bones. She was the descendant of Alexander's general Ptolemy, heir to a dynasty that had ruled Egypt when Rome was still a collection of mud huts beside the Tiber. Her bloodline had survived Persian invasions, civil wars, and palace coups. She would not be the one to break that chain of survival, no matter what the cost. Antony's struggle was more visible, more painful to watch. He had been raised to be a Roman, taught that honor mattered more than life, that duty to the Republic was sacred above all else. His flight from Actium had shattered something fundamental in his sense of self, leaving him adrift in a world where his old certainties no longer applied. Some days, he would rage against fate, pacing the palace halls like a caged lion. Other days, he would sink into melancholy, so deep that even Cleopatra's gentle touch could barely reach him. Yet slowly, gradually, he began to find a different kind of peace. In Cleopatra's arms, he discovered that love could be its own form of honor, that choosing her over Rome was not betrayal, but the truest act of his life. The man who had once measured his worth in conquered territories and defeated enemies began to find value in smaller victories. The smile that lit her face when he brought her flowers from the garden, the way her hand sought his during difficult meetings with advisors, the quiet contentment of lying beside her as dawn painted the harbor gold. Winter deepened over Alexandria, bringing cool winds from the north and news that Octavian's forces had reached the borders of Egypt itself. The endgame was approaching, with the inevitability of the Nile's annual flood, and both lovers knew their choices were narrowing to a final, terrible decision. They could surrender and hope for mercy from a victor who had shown precious little of it to his other enemies. They could flee to some distant corner of the world and live out their days in exile. Or they could choose an ending that remained entirely their own. It was Cleopatra who first spoke the word that had haunted their private conversations for weeks. Death, she said one evening, as they stood watching the lighthouse's beam sweep across the harbor, was the last freedom left to those who had lost everything else. The pharaohs of old had been buried with their treasures so they could rule in the afterlife as they had ruled on earth. Perhaps she and Antony could find in death the peace that had been denied them in life. Antony listened to her words with the attention of a man who had already been thinking similar thoughts. Roman honor demanded that a general who had lost his legions should fall on his sword rather than face the shame of capture. But this would not be a suicide, born of shame or despair. This would be love's final victory, a choice made together by two people who refused to let their enemies write the ending of their story. They began to make preparations with the same careful attention they had once devoted to military campaigns. Secret letters were sent to trusted allies, arranging for the safety of their children and the protection of their most loyal servants. Cleopatra's tomb, already under construction according to royal tradition, was hurried to completion. They would lie together in death as they had lived together in love, surrounded by the treasures of Egypt and the memories of their impossible romance. Yet even as they planned their final act, they continued to live each day as fully as possible. They held court with all the ceremony of rulers whose power remained unquestioned. They dined on delicacies from across their shrinking realm, toasting with wine that had aged in cellars older than Rome itself. They made love with the desperate intensity of people who knew their time was measured not in years or months, but in heartbeats. Word reached them that Octavian himself had arrived in Egypt, his legions making camp just beyond Alexandria's walls. The victor of Actium had come to claim his prize in person, to witness the end of the last independent Hellenistic kingdom and the final defeat of his greatest rival. Ambassadors arrived daily at the palace gates, offering terms for surrender that grew slightly more generous with each rejection, but never generous enough to tempt hearts that had already chosen their own path. On what would prove to be their last night together, Antony and Cleopatra climbed once more to their favorite tower overlooking the harbor. The city below them blazed with lights, its people celebrating the festival of Isis, despite the Roman army camped beyond their walls. Music drifted up from the streets, mixed with laughter and the sound of children playing games that had been old when the pyramids were young. They stood together in the warm night air, his arms around her waist, her head resting against his shoulder, and spoke quietly of the life they had shared. The magical evening in Tarsus, when a general had fallen in love with a goddess. The desperate reunion after his disastrous Parthian campaign. The golden afternoons in Alexandria, when they had ruled the eastern Mediterranean, like gods dispensing favors to mortals. The terrible beauty of their last battle, when love had proved stronger than duty, or honor, or the judgment of history. As dawn approached and the first light began to touch the distant horizon, they made their final vows to each other. Not the promises of lovers planning a future together, but the deeper commitment of souls preparing to journey beyond the reach of earthly power. They would meet whatever came next, as they had met everything since that first kiss, united in a love that had already burned brighter than empires, and would burn still when the names of their conquerors were forgotten. The sun rose over Alexandria for the last time on their reign, painting the harbor the color of molten gold. In a few hours, messengers would carry news to Octavian that would reshape the ancient world, that would make him the sole master of the Mediterranean and the first Roman emperor. But for now, in the growing light of dawn, Mark Antony and Cleopatra held each other close and whispered words that only lovers know, preparing to write the final chapter of a story that would echo through eternity. Their love had begun with a golden barge sailing toward destiny. Now, it would end with two hearts choosing to beat their last beats together, proving that some bonds are stronger than death itself. Some stories too beautiful for their enemies to destroy. In the growing light of their final dawn, they were no longer general and queen, Roman and Egyptian, conqueror and conquered. They were simply two people who had found in each other something worth dying for, something precious enough to carry beyond the reach of time itself. The news of their decision spread through the palace like ripples on still water. Servants who had tended them since childhood wept openly in the corridors, while guards who had sworn oaths to protect their queen now faced the impossible task of protecting her from herself. Yet none dared question the choice. They had watched these two souls burn together like twin flames, and they understood that such fire could not simply be extinguished by Roman steel. Cleopatra spent her final morning attending to the details of death with the same meticulous care she had once devoted to statecraft. She bathed in milk and honey, as pharaohs had done for generations, her skin perfumed with oils that had been blessed in temples older than memory. Her servants dressed her in robes of gold and purple, the colors of divinity, while her hair was arranged with the sacred uraeus, the serpent crown that marked her as daughter of the gods. Meanwhile, Antony sat in his chambers, writing letters that would never be sent, putting words to thoughts that had lived unspoken in his heart. To his children in Rome, he wrote of love and honor, trying to explain choices that defied explanation. To his soldiers, he offered apologies for leading them into disaster and gratitude for following him so far. To Octavian, strangely, he wrote words of respect for a worthy enemy, acknowledging the political genius that had outmaneuvered them both. The palace had taken on the hushed quality of a temple, as if the very stones understood they were witnessing something sacred. Courtiers moved through the halls, speaking in whispers, their footsteps muffled on marble floors that had echoed with laughter just days before. In the gardens, flowers still bloomed in defiance of winter, their colors bright against the gathering gloom. As the afternoon sun began its descent toward the western horizon, Cleopatra sent for the asp, the sacred serpent of Egypt, whose bite was said to grant immortality to those worthy of the gods' favor. It arrived in a basket of figs, hidden among the fruit, like death disguised as nourishment. The servant who brought it was an old woman who had served in the palace since Cleopatra was a child, her face streaked with tears, but her hands steady as stone. In their private chambers, the lovers performed their final ritual together. They shared wine from a cup that had been blessed by priests of Isis, taking turns to drink as they had shared everything else in their years together. The liquid tasted of honey and myrrh, of tears and eternity. With each sip, they toasted the memories that had made their love immortal. The first meeting in Tarsus, when gods had walked among mortals. The desperate reunion after Parthia, when broken hearts had found healing in each other's arms. The golden days in Alexandria, when they had ruled the world from their bed. Antony went first, as Roman honor demanded. He fell upon his sword with the same courage he had shown in a dozen battles. His final words, a prayer to whatever gods might carry him to the place where love conquered death. Cleopatra held him as his life flowed away, her tears falling like rain on his face as she whispered the endearments they had shared in happier times. When his breathing finally stilled, she kissed his lips one last time, tasting salt and sorrow and the metallic tang of approaching eternity. Alone now, but for the servants who had chosen to remain until the end, Cleopatra arranged herself upon the golden couch where she had received ambassadors and lovers, where she had planned campaigns and dreamed of conquest. She looked like a goddess prepared for apotheosis. Her robes spread around her like the wings of some magnificent bird preparing for flight. The asp, when she lifted it from its basket, seemed almost eager to fulfill its sacred purpose, its eyes reflecting the last light of the setting sun. The bite, when it came, was surprisingly gentle, like the kiss of sleep itself. The poison worked quickly through her veins, bringing not agony, but a strange, floating peace. As darkness gathered at the edges of her vision, she seemed to see Antony waiting for her in the shadows, his hand extended to guide her across the threshold between worlds. Around them, she could hear the music that had played on that first magical evening in Tarsus, when a general had fallen in love with a queen and changed the course of history. Her final breath was a whisper of his name, carried on air that tasted of jasmine and eternity. The servants found her there as the moon rose over Alexandria, beautiful even in death, her face peaceful as a child's in sleep. On her lips was the faintest hint of a smile, as if she had seen something in those final moments that made all their struggles worthwhile. When Octavian arrived at the palace gates the next morning, expecting to claim his prisoners and parade them through Rome as trophies of victory, he found instead 2 lovers who had cheated him of his triumph. They lay together in death as they had lived in life, united beyond the reach of politics or revenge. Even the future emperor, hardened by years of civil war, was said to have stood silent for long moments before their bodies, perhaps recognizing something in their stillness that his victory could never touch. The news of their deaths spread across the Mediterranean faster than ships could carry it. In Rome, some celebrated the end of a threat to the Republic. Others, perhaps remembering their own capacity for love, felt something approaching grief for 2 people who had dared to put passion above prudence. In Alexandria, the people mourned not just their queen, but the end of an age, the final chapter in a story that had begun when Alexander's generals carved up the world between them. They were buried together in the tomb Cleopatra had prepared, surrounded by treasures that would accompany them into whatever realm awaited souls who had loved without compromise. The golden barge that had carried her to Tarsus was placed beside their sarcophagi, its purple sails folded like the wings of a sleeping bird. Priests of Isis and Roman augurs alike pronounced blessings over their remains, as if even death could not decide whether they belonged to Egypt or Rome or to some country known only to lovers. Yet their story did not end with burial. In the years that followed, as Octavian transformed himself into Augustus, and the Roman Republic became an empire, the tale of Antony and Cleopatra grew beyond history into legend. Poets sang of their passion in verses that outlived the stones of their monuments. Lovers throughout the ages would whisper their names as proof that some bonds transcend mortality, that some stories are too beautiful for death to destroy, and so they sleep still. These two impossible lovers, in whatever realm receives hearts that chose each other over empires. Their love had begun with a golden barge sailing toward destiny and ended with two souls choosing to journey beyond the reach of earthly power. They had risked everything for a chance to love without apology, to write their names across the stars in letters of fire and gold. In the end, they succeeded beyond their wildest dreams, proving that some victories can only be measured in the currency of devotion. Some triumphs exist only in the space between hearts that refuse to let go. Let their story carry you now into your own dreams, where love conquers death and passion burns eternal, where two voices whisper across the centuries that some things are worth any price, and that the greatest empires of all are built not of stone and gold, but of moments when two souls recognize each other across the chaos of the world and choose never to look away. To look away. And so ends the story of Cleopatra and Mark Antony, a love that burned so bright it lit the ancient world and still glows in the darkness of history 2,000 years later. As you drift into sleep tonight, carry with you the image of two hearts that chose each other over everything else, that proved love could be stronger than armies, more enduring than empires, more precious than all the gold in Egypt or all the glory of Rome. Their tale reminds us that the greatest stories are not about conquest or power, but about the courage to love without reservation, to risk everything for that one person who makes your soul feel complete. In a world that demanded they choose between duty and desire, between politics and passion, they chose each other again and again, until death itself became just another threshold to cross together. Tonight, as Alexandria's lighthouse has long since crumbled and Rome's eagles no longer soar over the Mediterranean, their love endures in every whispered promise between lovers, in every heart that beats a little faster at the sight of someone special, in every soul brave enough to believe that love is worth any price. They taught us that some bonds transcend time, that some stories are too beautiful for mortality to contain, that two people who truly find each other can build an empire that lasts forever in the space between heartbeats. Close your eyes now and let their eternal embrace carry you gently into dreams where golden barges sail on starlit waters, where jasmine blooms in moonlit gardens, and where love writes itself across the heavens in letters that will never fade. Sleep well, knowing that somewhere beyond the reach of earthly power, Mark Antony and Cleopatra still hold each other close, proving that some loves are indeed strong enough to conquer death itself.